In a small southern town, a black woman dared to defend a Hell's Angel inside her diner. The next morning, 300 bikers roared into town, and what happened left everyone speechless. The morning in Elkridge always came slow, like the town itself was reluctant to wake. The streets still wore the blue-gray of night, storefronts shuttered tight, sidewalks chipped and empty. Fog clung to the line of pines that bordered Main Street, heavy and reluctant, as if it too wanted to stay hidden. Nothing moved but the occasional flicker of a streetlight fighting against the dawn. Inside Ila's table, the only black-owned diner in the county, the silence cracked open with the click of a switch. Fluorescent bulbs hummed to life, spilling a pale glow across empty booths and scuffed linoleum floors. Ila Brooks stood alone behind the counter, her breath caught in her chest for a second before she let it out in a quiet sigh. She did that every morning, pausing to ask herself if she had the strength for another day. She reached up, smoothing the frayed edge of her mother's old apron. Her braids were tied neatly under a navy head wrap, the same way her mother used to wear hers. Her hands moved by memory now, flipping the sign to open, wiping down a counter that didn't need wiping, straightening salt shakers lined up like soldiers, checking the register. $32 and some change. Not enough, never enough. She swallowed down the knot that rose in her throat and turned toward the coffee pot. The aroma filled the empty space with something close to comfort, though it faded fast, replaced by the weight of unpaid bills waiting in her purse. Electricity past due. Hospital deposits still out of reach. Her father's medication slipping further from the list of things she could cover. She poured herself a cup anyway, pressing the warmth between her palms, standing at the window to look out at Main Street. Nothing. The hardware store had been closed for years, the factory boarded up last winter. Only the gas station still hung on, run by an old couple who hadn't met her eyes since she was 10 years old. Once this town had gathered here. Once people filled the booths with laughter, clinking glasses, voices loud with stories. That was when her mother Gloria ran the place, when the air smelled like pancakes and hope. Now, the silence inside the diner matched the silence outside, thick, watching, waiting. A shadow passed by the window. She glanced up, catching the shape of a man crossing the street. His eyes flicked toward the diner, then away quickly, too quickly, like contact might burn. He didn't come in. He didn't even slow down. Another figure followed a minute later, a woman carrying groceries. Her gaze hit the glass just long enough for Ila to notice the curl of her mouth, the faint trace of contempt, before she lowered her head and hurried on. Ila set her cup down, grabbed a towel, and walked to the door. On the glass, faint but still there, was a smear of letters left from yesterday's condensation. Someone had drawn words with a finger, then rubbed them half away. The ghost of it lingered, go back. She pressed her palm against the cool glass, not angry, not even surprised. Just tired. She scrubbed at it until only her reflection stared back, the outline of her face framed in the foggy morning light. Behind her, the bell over the door stayed silent. The diner remained as it was, empty and waiting. She went back to her counter, took another sip of coffee, and opened her notebook, the one where she kept track of bills and scraps of plans that never seemed to survive the month. Her pen hovered, but no words came. Outside, another set of footsteps scuffed the pavement, slowed at her window, then quickened again. She could feel it, the eyes that slid over her like she wasn't worth the time, the weight of a town that never forgot what color she was. In Elkridge, silence wasn't absence. It was rejection. It was punishment. And still she kept the lights on, still she cleaned every corner like the president himself might walk in. Because this diner wasn't just four walls and a counter. It was her inheritance, her fight, the last piece of her mother she could hold. She stood there, rag in hand, looking at the doorway. The air outside was too quiet, the kind of quiet that pressed down heavy, promising that when something finally did break it would break hard. By noon the heat had settled over Elkridge like a heavy blanket nobody asked for. The cicadas outside hummed an endless chorus, their shrill rhythm pressing against the glass of Ila's diner. Inside, the ceiling fan turned in slow, uneven circles, stirring the air more than it cooled it. Ila wiped the same section of counter for the third time, not because it needed it but because silence demanded something to fill it. The bell above the door finally jingled, sharp in the stillness. She looked up. He filled the doorway before he even meant to. A broad-shouldered man, leather jacket scuffed and dusty from the road, jeans worn at the knees, boots heavy with dirt. The patch on his chest was unmistakable, a skull with wings, flames curling from its sides. Hell's Angels. For a moment the room seemed to tighten around him. He moved with the slow stiffness of someone carrying too many miles on his back, each step pressing a groan from the floorboards. He lowered himself onto the stool closest to the emergency exit, his large hand gripping the counter like it needed to hold him upright. His knuckles were scarred, his beard more salt than pepper, his pale blue eyes ringed red with fatigue. When he lifted a hand to rub the back of his neck, Ila caught sight of it, a faded hospital bracelet peeking from under his sleeve. She paused, towel still in her hand, then walked over. "Welcome to Ila's table," she said, her voice even. "Today's special is smoked brisket with sweet cornbread. We've got peach tea and coffee. What can I start for you?" He looked up at her a second too long, long enough for her to see something beneath the rough exterior. Not aggression, not menace. Grief. "Coffee," he said finally, "black, quick as you got it." She poured and set the cup in front of him. "Hot and strong," she told him. "It'll kick like a mule." He let out a chuckle, more air than sound. When he reached for the mug, his hand trembled. The coffee rippled against the rim. "You all right?" she asked softly, not as a waitress but as a human being. His voice was low, scratchy. "My daughter's at Elkridge General. She's 15. Stage 4. They told me to stay close. Just wait." The words landed heavy between them. Ila nodded, her chest tight. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. He nodded once, eyes fixed on the dark liquid in his cup. "Hospital's got too many beeps, too many whispers," he added. "I needed a place to breathe." Ila let the silence hold. She didn't fill it with false comfort, didn't reach for easy phrases. She just stood steady behind the counter, letting him have space. And as she looked at the trembling hand around that coffee cup, a memory clawed its way back. A different afternoon. The sun high, heat clinging to her skin as she carried trash from the diner. A patrol car parked crooked across the street, engine still running. A boy no older than 16 pinned against the hood, his backpack spilled open, notebooks and a half-eaten sandwich scattered across the pavement. Officer Brent Hollis stood behind him, one hand gripping the boy's wrist, the other resting heavy on the gun at his hip. The boy's lips moved fast, pleading words Ila couldn't hear. She remembered the way her heart pounded as she crossed the street, steady but fast. "Brent," she'd called, "what's going on?" "Business, Ila," he'd said without turning. "Keep walking." "He a customer of mine," she shot back. "Then this is my business." Brent had turned, slow, a smile curled on his mouth, humorless. "You questioning me now?" She remembered the smell of sweat and coffee on his breath when he leaned close, telling her this town had rules, that she ought to remember her place. And she remembered the steel in her own voice when she answered, "I know my place. Behind that counter, building something with my mother's hands. Not watching a kid get humiliated on my sidewalk." The boy's eyes had met hers then, wide with confusion, flickers of hope. Brent had released him, muttering, "You're making a mistake." "Maybe," she'd said, "but I'd rather make that mistake than stay silent." The boy had run off without brushing dust from his jeans, but she never forgot the weight of his gaze. And now, looking at the biker across her counter, she felt that same weight. He looked dangerous to the town. To her, he looked like another soul cornered by life, another human worth standing beside. He took a slow sip of coffee, set the mug down, and glanced at her again. "My name's Sam," he said quietly. "Sam Taylor." She nodded. "Ila Brooks." And in that brief exchange the image of a threat began to shift. This wasn't a biker to be feared. This was a father waiting in grief, clutching hope with trembling hands, just trying to breathe. The bell above the diner door gave a sharp jingle, louder than it should have been in the quiet. Ila looked up from the counter, her rag still in her hand. The man who stepped in carried the heat of the street with him, his boots striking hard against the tile. Officer Brent Hollis. His uniform crisp, badge polished to a gleam, pistol heavy on his hip like a threat in plain sight. Behind him followed Deputy Ellen Fox, a step slower, her blonde hair pinned tight beneath her cap, her expression unreadable. The air inside the diner shifted instantly, charged like the sky before a thunderstorm. Sam Taylor sat hunched over his coffee at the far end of the counter, his shoulders heavy, his hands wrapped around the mug as if it were the last steady thing he had. Brent spotted him and stopped, a slow grin spreading across his face, not from humor but from finding a bruise he wanted to press. "Well, well," he said, his voice cutting through the stillness like broken glass. "Didn't expect to see a Hell's Angel perched on a diner stool. Guess it must be one hell of a day." Sam didn't look up. He just tightened his grip on the mug, his knuckles trembling as the liquid rippled. Brent stepped closer, boots echoing against the floor. "Funny," he continued, "I always figured your kind preferred bars and back alleys, not sweet tea and home cooking." His laugh was dry, hollow. Ellen didn't join him. She stayed a pace behind, her hands clasped at her back, her eyes fixed on the floor for a moment too long. "Name and ID," Brent said suddenly, his voice sharp. Sam raised his head, his pale eyes meeting Brent's. "Excuse me," he said, voice low but steady. "You heard me," Brent snapped. "You match a dozen descriptions in a dozen reports. Could be harmless, could be something else. I'm going to need to see some ID." Sam reached slowly for his wallet, his hands shaking just enough to show he had nothing to hide, but Brent's hand moved quicker, resting on the grip of his holstered gun. That did it. Ila stepped out from behind the counter, her apron swinging lightly against her legs, her face set tight. "He's a customer, Brent," she said firmly. Brent didn't turn, his eyes locked on Sam. "You know who he is, don't you?" "I know he paid for his food," Ila shot back, "and he hasn't broken a single law since he walked through that door." Brent turned now, the smirk curling on his lips like poison. Well, first name basis, huh?" He stepped closer to her, lowering his voice, words thick with menace. "You really want to pick this fight with me again?" Ila's heart pounded, but her voice never wavered. "I'm not picking anything. But I won't stand here and watch you harass a man who's just drinking his coffee." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. The ceiling fan groaned, the refrigerator hummed, the clock above the pie case ticked far too loudly. Sam laid his wallet on the counter, his voice quieter than the room itself. "I don't want trouble," he said. Brent snatched the wallet and flipped it open, his eyes scanning the license longer than he needed to, as though searching for justification that wouldn't come. He snapped it shut and tossed it back onto the counter with a dull thud. "No warrants," he muttered. "Guess you get to live another day." Ellen shifted on her feet, her eyes flicking between Brent, Ila, and Sam. She still said nothing. "Let's go," Brent barked. Without a word, Ellen followed him out. The door swung shut behind them, the bell giving a harsh jingle that echoed long after their boots were gone. Ila stood rooted to the floor, her fists clenched tight at her sides. Her chest rose and fell with controlled breaths, but her eyes stayed steady, unbroken. Sam picked up his wallet, sliding it back into his jacket with a hand that still trembled. He looked at her across the counter, his voice rough but clear. "You didn't have to do that." Ila met his gaze, standing straight. "Yes, I did." His expression shifted then, something unreadable flickering in his eyes, a mixture of confusion, gratitude, and respect. He drained the last sip of his coffee and pushed the mug away, the scrape against the counter louder than it should have been. Ila stayed where she was, shoulders squared, the weight of the moment pressing hard against the small diner walls. For a long second the silence spoke louder than any words. In that silence one truth stood undeniable. In a town where authority walked with a badge and a gun, the only person willing to hold the line was a black woman behind a counter, refusing to look away. The next morning the diner looked the same from the outside, but the silence carried a different weight. Ila unlocked the door just after sunrise and found it waiting for her. The first strike came quick, a dull thud against the window that left a smear of yellow sliding down the glass. Then another, louder, wetter. Eggs. Soon the glass was streaked with yolk, dripping in uneven lines, clinging to the frame. A tomato followed, bursting red against the wood, its juice bleeding across the menu board outside. The smell hit almost immediately, sour and heavy, a mix of rot and cowardice. She stood still for a long second, her keys still in her hand, before setting her jaw and pushing the door open anyway. Inside, the air was thick and stale. The refrigerator hummed once and went dead. She flipped the breaker in the back, already knowing what it meant. The power had been cut. She filled a small pan with the last of the melted ice and soaked her rag, carrying it back to the window. She pressed hard against the glass, each stroke smearing more than it cleaned, each pass a battle against the stink. Her hand shook, but she kept wiping, her breath fogging the glass until her own reflection looked back at her through streaks of yellow and red. She whispered under her breath, steadying herself with each pass. The bell above the door jingled once, faint. She turned quickly, but no one entered. On the floor just inside the frame lay a folded piece of paper, shoved through the gap. She picked it up slowly, unfolding it with wet fingers. 2 words in thick red marker stared back. "Watch yourself." She stood frozen, the paper trembling slightly in her grip. Then she crumpled it tight in her fist and dropped it into the trash. The silence afterward was sharper than any threat. By mid-morning no one had come in. Not even Pete, the trucker who usually slid into his booth without a word. Outside, people walked past without glancing, some crossing the street rather than look through her window. One man slowed, met her eyes for half a breath, then turned away quickly, pretending not to see her at all. It was the same kind of rejection she had grown used to, only now it had teeth. At noon the door rattled softly. She looked up to see Miss Owens, the church secretary, standing on the sidewalk in her floral dress. The woman's hand hovered near the handle but never touched it. She kept her distance, her mouth pressed thin. "I can't come in," she said, voice muffled through the glass. "I just wanted you to know not everyone agrees with what they're doing." Ila walked to the door, opened it just a crack. "And yet," she said quietly, "you weren't here yesterday." Miss Owens looked down at the pavement. "I was scared." Ila held her gaze steady. "So am I," she said. "But I didn't get to leave." Miss Owens shifted on her feet, nodded once, and turned away. "I'll bring some pies tomorrow," she murmured before walking down the street. Ila closed the door and locked it again, leaning her forehead against the wood. The ache in her chest pressed heavy, the weight of betrayal and isolation pressing down until her knees nearly buckled. She walked back to the counter, her eyes catching the framed photo on the wall, her mother Gloria smiling in a stained apron, her eyes alive with defiance. Ila's hand reached out, fingers brushing the frame. For a moment she let herself shake, let her throat tighten until the tears threatened. She almost turned off the lights, almost let the silence win. Instead she pulled her hand back, squared her shoulders, and whispered to the photo, to herself, to the diner. "Still here. Still mine." The words landed flat in the empty room, but they carried enough weight to hold her up for one more day. The hospital room was too quiet. Machines blinked and beeped in slow intervals, a rhythm that felt like it measured hope and despair in equal turns. Sam Taylor sat slouched forward in a chair beside the bed, his elbows on his knees, his hands locked together so tightly the knuckles went white. His daughter lay there, Jessie, her chest rising and falling with shallow effort, her face pale but still soft, still young. 15 years old, caught between life and the cruel hand that held her in place. Sam's leather jacket hung over the back of the chair, his hospital bracelet still clinging to his wrist, a reminder that he belonged in both worlds and neither. He stared at the floor until his vision blurred. He had always believed in loyalty, in brotherhood, in carrying weight for others. But now all he could think about was a woman who carried weight she never should have had to. A diner owner who had stood between him and a gun, who had looked a police officer in the eye and refused to flinch. Ila Brooks. He pulled his phone out of his pocket, his thumb hovering over a name he hadn't dialed in over a year. Marvin Taylor. His younger brother. Former combat medic. Now a patched member of the Hells Angels Central Ridge chapter. Sam stared at the screen so long the glow felt like it burned into his skin. He could hear the words in his head before he spoke them, but he hesitated, his throat tight. He didn't want to drag anyone into this. He didn't want the weight of his trouble to crush her life. But then he saw her face again, steady and unshaken, standing in front of him while Brent's hand gripped his gun. He heard her voice. This diner was built on food and fairness. I serve anyone who walks through that door. He pressed the call button. Marvin's voice cracked through on the second ring, rough, alert. Sam. It's me, Sam said, voice low. A pause. Damn, Marvin muttered. You okay? Sam's throat burned as he spoke. I don't want her to pay for standing up for me. She's alone in that diner. The town's turning on her. They're cutting her power, throwing garbage at her door. It's my fault. Silence hummed on the line, thick with understanding. You want me to call the club? Marvin asked. Sam closed his eyes, let the words settle heavy on his tongue before pushing them out. No. Bring them. There was no hesitation on the other end now. You got it, Marvin said, and the line went dead. Across town Ila sat in her darkened diner, the silence pressed against her ribs like a weight. The lights were out again, the coffee pot cold. She sat at the counter with her ledger open in front of her, pages of red ink staring back. She tapped her pen against the paper, the words she didn't want to write lingering just below her hand. Last day. She nearly wrote it. Nearly admitted defeat. The bell above the door stayed silent. No customers, no friends, just the sound of her own breath and the faint hum of the dying refrigerator. Then, faint at first, something stirred outside. A low rumble, distant, like thunder rolling beneath the hills. She looked up, her brow furrowing. The sound grew. Louder. Closer. The windows began to rattle in their frames. Coffee cups on the counter vibrated against the surface. She stood slowly, her hand pressed to the glass. Engines. Dozens of them. Then more. The sound built until it swallowed the street, until it felt like the ground itself shook. Ila's breath caught as she stepped closer to the window. Around the bend they came, first in twos and threes, then in lines that stretched the length of Main Street. Chrome glinted in the sunlight, leather vests flashed with patches from every chapter, every city within riding distance. Tires thundered against the pavement as they filled both sides of the street, engines roaring in unison like a declaration. The diner windows trembled with the force. She staggered back a step, eyes wide, heart hammering. People stepped out of shops, frozen on the sidewalks. Some gasped. Others frowned, confused, unsettled. Within minutes the road was packed, wall to wall with motorcycles, handlebars gleaming, kickstands dropping to the asphalt in one synchronized motion. 300 strong. The air smelled of exhaust, hot rubber, and something else Ila hadn't felt in weeks. Power. Not the kind that threatened. The kind that protected. The bell above the diner door jingled once. A man stepped inside. He was tall, built like a post driven into the earth, his vest worn but neat, patches stitched with care. His beard was short, his expression calm but unyielding. "Miss Brooks," he said. Ila's throat tightened. "Yes. Marvin Taylor," he said. "Sam's brother." Ila's face softened but she didn't move from behind the counter. "Is Jessie, she's fighting," Marvin cut in. "That girl's tough." Ila nodded, her hand gripping the counter edge. Marvin looked around the diner, his eyes sharp, then pulled a small radio from his pocket. "How long's it been like this?" he asked. "Since the day your brother walked in," she whispered. Marvin nodded once. Then clicked the radio. "Now." The sound outside rose like a wave crashing. Engines revved in unison, fists pounded handlebars, and the street shook beneath the weight of 300 riders who had answered a call. Ila stepped back, her chest rising fast, her eyes glassy as the realization sank in. She had been left alone by her own town. But now, at her door, stood an army. Not of officials, not of neighbors, but of the very men and women the town feared most. And they had come for her. By sunrise the next day the diner no longer sat in silence. The bell above the door barely stopped ringing. The smell of bacon and coffee mingled with the tang of leather and gasoline as Ila moved fast behind the counter, her apron already stained, her hands working on muscle memory. Every stool was taken, every booth crowded with men and women in patched vests, their laughter rolling through the room like a tide. Plates clinked, forks scraped, and for the first time in weeks the walls of Ila's table held more than loneliness. Outside, the street was lined with motorcycles like polished steel statues, engines still ticking from the ride. Locals had begun to gather on the sidewalks, their steps hesitant, their eyes wary. They whispered to each other, stealing glances through the windows at the sight of Hell's Angels sitting shoulder to shoulder over pancakes and cornbread. Children crept closer, drawn by the gleam of chrome and the thunder still echoing in their ears. One boy, Jacob Turner, reached up toward a bright red Harley. A biker with braided beard and skull cap crouched beside him, steadying the bike with one hand. "Careful now," he said, his voice patient, showing Jacob where to place his feet, how to grip the handlebars. The boy's eyes went wide, his smile breaking across his face as he settled onto the seat. Around the corner of the diner another girl sat on the curb, braiding her doll's hair while watching a tattooed rider lace his boots. When she asked about the knots he knelt down, showing her step by step, his fingers moving slow, careful. Inside the diner Ruth Langley, whose voice had once been sharp enough to cut, sat stiff in a booth. Across from her a biker woman leaned back casually, silver braid over her shoulder, arms covered in ink. Her vest read Linda, East Valley Chapter. She held knitting needles in her hands, showing Ruth a pattern. Ruth tried it clumsily, muttered a curse, then laughed. Not the polite, rehearsed laugh Ila had heard from her before. A full laugh, surprised out of her chest. Linda grinned wide. "Told her if I'm going to sit with someone who knits better than I ride, I better keep my ears open." Ruth chuckled again, shaking her head, the sound softening the air around her. Ila caught sight of it as she refilled mugs along the counter. For a moment she froze, watching the unlikely picture. The same woman who once whispered that folks should know their place now leaning over yarn and needles with a biker. Change didn't come in speeches. It came in small, unguarded moments like this. The bell over the door chimed again. Ila looked up and her breath caught. Ellen Fox. No uniform. No badge. Just jeans, a gray shirt, her blonde hair pulled back loose. She stepped to the counter, her face tired, less rigid than before. "Coffee," she said quietly. "Black." Ila poured without a word, slid the mug across. Their fingers brushed as Ellen took it. "Thank you," she said, her eyes lifting to meet Ila's. "I should have said something before. I should have stopped it." Ila's face stayed calm, but her voice was steady. You didn't throw the eggs. No, Ellen admitted, but I stood too still while others did. I'm not proud of that. Silence lingered, then Ila set a biscuit on a plate and slid it to her. Eat, she said. Talking's easier on a full stomach. A faint smile tugged at Ellen's lips. She lowered her eyes and took a bite. The door opened again and this time the room hushed. A man stepped in with the kind of presence that turned heads without a sound. Dominic Turner, president of the Hells Angels Riverside chapter. His black leather vest was crisp, the words across the back bold and unmistakable. He walked with slow purpose to the center of the diner, Marvin a step behind him. The chatter fell quiet, forks paused halfway to mouths. Dominic scanned the room, his eyes sharp but not unkind, then stopped on Ila behind the counter. You must be Ila, he said, his voice deep, smooth, carrying weight without force. She nodded once. That's me. Dominic extended his hand. I've heard of you. His grip was firm when she took it. He turned then, raising his voice just enough for the entire room to hear. There are two things we live by in my world. Loyalty and respect. When someone gives us one, we give it back. And when someone risks everything to do what's right, we remember that too. Marvin handed him a folded leather vest. Dominic held it out toward Ila. From this day forward, Ila's table rides under the protection of the Hells Angels. The room erupted. Boots stomped against the floor, fists pounded tables, whistles cut sharp through the air. Ila stood frozen, her chest tight, her eyes shimmering as she took the vest, her fingers tracing the fresh stitching. Protected. She looked up and around the room. Faces that had once been strangers now nodded at her with respect. And beyond them, in the doorway, she saw something else. Joe Larkin, the farmer, his hat in his hands. Behind him his daughter Elise. And then Ruth Langley's son. Locals who hadn't stepped foot inside her diner since it all began. Joe walked forward, his voice rough. I was wrong, he said. I saw what happened, and I didn't say anything. I'm sorry. Elise touched Ila's arm gently. My mom always told me you gave me free apple slices when I was little. She never forgot that. More followed. Some whispered apologies. Some just nodded. But they came. One by one. Ila lifted the vest high, then turned and hung it on the wall beside her mother's photo. It looked right there, like it belonged. The diner buzzed again with voices, with the scrape of forks, with the sound of people who had once looked away now sitting together, eating, laughing. Outside, children darted between bikes like it was a playground, their laughter rising above the thrum of cooling engines. For the first time in too long, the air in Elkridge felt lighter. Not because the town had been forced to change, but because one woman behind a counter had refused to bend. And now, the people who once feared her light were beginning to see by it. The morning light in Elkridge had a different tone now. It wasn't heavy or reluctant the way it had been weeks before. Sunlight spilled through the windows of Ila's table in long golden lines, warming the booths, glinting against the coffee pots, turning the worn tile floor into something softer. The diner hummed with a low comfort, plates stacked neatly, counters shining, the faint smell of biscuits drifting from the oven. On the wall above the counter hung two things side by side, her mother Gloria's framed photo in a stained apron, and beneath it a black leather vest stitched fresh in white. Protected. It hung like a promise, a reminder that the diner stood for more than coffee and cornbread now. Ila moved behind the counter, her hands steady, her steps sure. She had been through silence and storm, and somehow the floor beneath her feet felt stronger. The bell above the door jingled gently. She turned and froze for a heartbeat. Sam Taylor stepped inside. He looked different. The same broad shoulders, the same black jacket, but his eyes were clearer now, lighter, like someone had lifted a weight from his chest. He carried an envelope in one hand, his boots quieter than before as he crossed the room. "Morning, Ila," he said, voice low but warm. "Morning, Sam." She poured him a cup of coffee without asking, set it on the counter. He wrapped his hands around it, no tremble this time. "She's improving," he said softly. "Jessie. The new treatment's working. Her color's back. She's laughing again." Ila's throat tightened, her eyes shimmering, though she blinked the tears back. "That's incredible." Sam nodded slowly, his voice catching. "I didn't think we'd get this far. She asked me to come today." Ila tilted her head, brows lifting. Sam slid the envelope across the counter. "She wanted you to have this." Ila opened it carefully. Inside was a drawing in colored pencil. A sketch of the diner, herself behind the counter, handing a mug of coffee to a man in a biker vest. Above it, in shaky handwriting, were 4 words. "Be kind. Be brave." Ila's hand trembled as she held it. She pressed the paper gently against her chest, her breath unsteady. Sam watched her, his own eyes damp. "She said," he whispered, "you're who she hopes to be one day." Ila looked down at the drawing again, then back at Sam. "Tell her I'd love to meet her." Sam smiled faintly, the kind of smile born from exhaustion and gratitude mixed together. "You'll see her soon." He finished his coffee, left the mug half full on the counter, and touched the brim of his jacket in a small gesture of respect before stepping out into the sun. The diner fell quiet again, but not empty. A different quiet. One that carried hope. A few minutes later the bell above the door rang once more. Sheriff Brent Hollis stood in the doorway. No sunglasses. No swagger. Just a man in a tan shirt with rolled sleeves, his shoulders stiff, his eyes tired. He stepped inside, his boots dragging slightly against the floor. Ila didn't move. She poured another cup of coffee, set it on the counter, and waited. Brent took off his hat, held it in his hands for a moment before placing it on the stool beside him. He didn't sit yet. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his badge. Without looking up, he set it on the counter between them. "I saw what happened here," he said slowly. "I saw what I let happen. I should have known better." His voice faltered. Maybe some rules weren't made for the right reasons. Ila didn't respond. She didn't forgive, didn't thank him. She let the silence stand heavy, let him sit with the weight of his own words. Brent finally lowered himself onto the stool, wrapping his hands around the mug she'd set down. He sipped once, his jaw tight, his eyes on the dark liquid. The silence pressed in, not hostile this time but unyielding. Ila stood tall behind the counter, steady, letting him face it. Minutes passed that way, 2 people sharing the same room but divided by choices that couldn't be undone with a single sentence. Brent finally nodded, more to himself than to her. Then he stood, picked up his hat, and left the badge behind. The bell gave a soft jingle as the door closed. Ila looked at the badge for a long moment, then turned her eyes to the wall. Her mother's smile in the photo seemed to meet hers, the leather vest hanging proud beside it. She whispered under her breath, more to the memory than to the room itself. "We're still standing, Mama." Outside, the town moved on as always. But inside that diner, the air carried something different. Not victory, not celebration. Just quiet courage, steady as a heartbeat, waiting for the next person who would need it. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.